Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar titled Making HEOR More Accessible to Patients. This webinar has been sponsored by Open Health, so a big thanks to them for helping to make this event possible. We're very fortunate to have 6 panelists joining us today for an exciting roundtable discussion. Hi, Gavin. Thanks for being here today, and take it away whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Sydney, and thanks for all your support. Hello, my name is Gavin Jones, and I work for Open Health as an advisor on patient centricity and rare disease. Thanks for joining this webinar. We have a diverse audience out there, which is great. The topic of this conversation is making HEOR more accessible to patients, unlocking the potential for trusted partnerships and better outcomes. HEOR, or Health Economics and Outcomes Research, are the processes that investigate and communicate unmet patient needs and treatment gaps, together with evaluating and communicating the efficacy and cost effectiveness of treatments in the real world. HEOR is currently being revolutionized by big data and technological advances to effectively harness its power. Patient centricity needs to play a fundamental role if we are to maximize the potential and minimize the risks of these technological drivers. In parallel, we are seeing patient communities taking more ownership of their health outcomes and their data. We need to activate these communities as partners in HEOR that will in turn create positive virtual circles for faster and improved research processes and ultimately better outcomes for patient communities. To build trusted and sustained partnerships, we need to engage these communities with transparency, humility, and inclusivity across the 4 engagement domains of HEOR. These domains are as follows: having an underlying intent to improve outcomes, ensuring involvement at every step of the process, being inspired by the moments that matter most to patients and their families, and ensuring stakeholders are informed of the results in a way that is understandable to them. So lots to think about and lots to get right. And we at Open Health are committed to making HEOR more accessible to patients. In a fortnight, we will share a white paper discussing this topic in greater depth. In the meantime, I'm delighted to be joined by a panel of experts to give their own perspectives on this critical topic. I will let the panel introduce themselves, and then we'll kick off with some questions I have. It goes without saying that we are very keen to hear from you, so please do share any questions you have in the box below. We're going to bring the panel onto the screen now, and we're going to go around and have introductions from them all. And we'll start with Danielle, then Josie, Christine, Kelly, and Beth. So Danielle, if you'd like to kick us off with introductions, please.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me and inviting me for this amazing webinar. As you said, my name is Danielle, and I live in Denmark. I am the mother to 2 beautiful children, Noah and Savannah, who lives with the rare disease. The name is very long and complex. It's pathological idiopathic ketotic hypoglycemia. What is less known is that after my daughter received her diagnosis, I too was diagnosed with the same diagnosis. So I live with unexplained low blood sugar and high ketones. I'm not a medical doctor, nor was I educated in conducting research at all. But after years living with life-threatening hypoglycemia and life and death situations, I now consider myself an expert in my children's rare disease. And I am now the founder of a global reaching rare disease patient organization called Ketotic Hypoglycemia International, where the families are driving and pushing research forward. So thank you for having me. I'm so delighted and honored to be invited to be here today.
Great. Thanks, Danielle. Josie.
Thanks, Gavin. Lovely to be part of this panel. I'm Josie Godfrey. I have been working in rare diseases, and particularly market access and policy for about 12 years now. So despite not being a health economist, I actually set up the NICE Highly Specialized Technologies Program and have worked in market access, supporting patient organizations and supporting companies for a number of a number of years now. I run on behalf of Duchenne UK patient group a project called Project Hercules, which is a collaborative patient-driven effort to develop evidence and tools specifically for HEOR for health economics. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you, Josie. Over to you, Christina.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation today. My name is Christine Sørensen. I'm Danish and I'm based in Aarhus, Denmark. I'm the president of the International Health Literacy Association, and I'm pleased to discuss accessibility and how we can indeed work with patients in a much better way, as also Danielle has mentioned today.
Excellent. Thank you. Over to Kelly. Oh, you're on mute, Kelly.
I'm on mute.
There we go.
Thank you all for joining today. I'm Kelly McCarrier. I'm a director in the Patient-Centered Outcomes Center of Excellence here at Open Health, and I serve as our qualitative research service area lead. I'm a health services researcher by training, and I now sort of lead projects focused on collecting qualitative and mixed methods patient insight, primarily focused on the development and validation of patient-reported outcome instruments and then consulting on regulatory interactions related to those measurement strategies. So thank you all for joining.
Excellent. Thanks, Kelly. Over to Beth.
Hi, everyone. Gavin, thank you so much for inviting me to join this panel. Like Kelly, I also work for Open Health, a bit in a different role. I am a communication specialist, and my job is to actually help our scientists communicate the results of the research that they are conducting. I am a pharmacist by training, and for about the last 20 years or so, I have been a value communication specialist. Thank you.
Thank you. Great stuff. We've got a brilliant panel, and I'm going to dive into some questions. But like I said at the start, really like to hear from you as well. So if you have any questions for the panel, please do fire them in and we'll get to them a little bit later on. But I wanted to come to you, Danielle, first and talk a little bit more about being thrown into the world of healthcare and research, and just wanted to get a perspective on how daunting it was for you.
Well, that's a quite interesting question, because without the research, my life was daunting. And I just want to give a bit of background information. I gave birth to my son, Noah. I was 23 years old, and I was studying a bachelor in social education. When I had my baby boy in my arms, I thought, well, this is joy, this is motherhood, everything was perfect. But suddenly when we found ourselves in the NICU, and we were suddenly thrown with the fact that we didn't know if he would survive. And after that, we had to realize the fact that, and that was horrible, the doctors had no clue what was going on with him. Then we realized, okay, so what we thought was like a world of answers in a hospital was suddenly a world of despair, where no doctors could tell us why this was happening and how we could prevent it from happening. So when we realized that there were no answers out there, we were hopeless. I was threatening the hospital to put up a tent at the cafeteria, because I would never leave the hospital, because they couldn't promise me that he wouldn't die while sleeping. And the hospital was like, but we can never promise you your child won't die. Well, how can I ever feel safe taking my child home if you can't tell me what's wrong with him? So after a few months, I think about a year, trying to find peace with the fact that no one knew what was wrong with him, I finally took the initiative to reach out and look for answers myself in the medical literature. And I was able to find some of the best experts in the world. And when I actually then acknowledged the fact that even the best in the world didn't know what was wrong with him, I was like, well, that's something we can work with. If no one knows what's wrong, then we just need to find the answers together. But without the patients, we couldn't find any answers, because we didn't have a patient group. We didn't have a patient organization. The only thing we had was rare symptoms. So alongside the best experts in the world, we were suddenly able to unite the families And when they were united, we could suddenly identify patterns that the experts didn't see before. And suddenly we suddenly were able together co-creating hope. Before there were no hope. It was simply a matter of wait and see if your child will get brain damage from hypoglycemia, or maybe you're lucky your child will live. Now we actually have hope because we are working together with the families to identify what could be the reason for their severe symptoms.
Well, that's really interesting, that sort of connection of hope with research. Do you want to just describe that a little bit more, Danielle?
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting concept.
Yeah, and that's one of the very, very difficult parts of having a rare disease or even being undiagnosed. The hope is simply not there. If you finally receive a diagnosis after years of searching for one, there might just be one expert on the other side of the planet. And when you reach that expert, there is zero funding. There might be one or two patients or families out there that this experts know of. And how can we ever look for answers with such a small database of data? When we are searching for answers, we need to use the strengths we have. So when we are uniting these patient communities, we are seeing it a lot on social media. We need to harness all of that data, and we need to have the support from the industry and the medical experts to use that data properly, because within the data, we have hope. Without the data, we can't search for cures. We can't search for any solutions. But currently, it's very, very difficult to find these resources and find the funding to create the patient registries. So with the patient registries, we can start to accelerate research, and we need the research to find hope for cures or treatments. Simply treatments, just to navigate everyday life. That's not something everyone has or has access to. Even a medical doctor who can prescribe the medicine you need, that's not for everyone. And that's not good enough, because we have the data. We might not have millions with this disease, but sometimes there is 50, other times there's several hundreds, and sometimes there's thousands of families with a lot of data they would like to share. We need a framework where we can create hope within the data.
Thank you, Danielle. Really, really important points there. And Josie, for me, that translation of hope into hard evidence that can make a difference for patient communities sounds very much like the journey that Duchenne's UK and Project Hercules has been on. And I wondered if you could provide a bit more context and color around that journey, and really, maybe touching on how the patient community has collaborated with the industry to accelerate its progress.
Sure, thanks, Gavin. So I've been working with Duchenne UK, as you say, on a project specifically focused on building the data for access, and it really came about when two mothers of boys with Duchenne came together and were involved, at least in watching and looking from slightly afar, the experience of the first licensed treatment in Europe for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and the amount of time it took to reach a decision about reimbursement, specifically in the UK, but this was echoed across Europe and beyond. And for a variety of reasons, one of the big ones was evidence. And I remember Emily Rubin, one of the two founders of Duchenne UK, saying she suddenly realized there was something worse than there being no treatment. And that was there being a treatment sitting on a shelf and nobody being able to work out how to pay for it and how to actually get it to patients. And I think that was a real eye-opening moment, and I see that repeated with advocacy group after advocacy group who focus so much energy on getting a treatment, on getting that early research, on supporting and don't always realize that the regulatory hurdle is not the last hurdle for patients, that actually there are more challenges that follow. So we came together, and Duchenne UK brought together interested companies, experts, patient organizations to explore how to tackle some of that evidence gap at a disease level. So this wasn't about the product that had gone through or any other product. Originally, it was to look, can we improve the economic model? Is there something we can do to help them? But actually, to build an economic model, you need a natural history model. You need burden of illness data. You need quality of life data. You need a huge number of inputs. And those inputs were not necessarily there, at least not there at the standard you would hope for. So we have the other woman I mentioned, Fleur Chandler. She is a mother of a boy with Duchenne. She's also a health economist of over 25 years standing. So she brought that technical expertise. I brought my NICE background, and that's been the core of this project. So every piece of work we've done has been driven by the patient organisation, working with now 12 companies, patient organisations from across the world. And we have been able to do that by being a collaboration. We've had organisations like NICE sitting on our steering group. We've been able to bring in really world-class experts to lead different pieces of work. And so now we've been able to create a sort of bottom-up, if you like, a patient experience up rather than a top-down natural history model in which we have articulated a disease state that didn't really feature in the published literature. We have built a DMD-specific quality of life metric, working with the University of Sheffield that's now been translated. Last I heard, we had another one, so there are 30 translations now for something like 27 countries. We have a disease-level economic model that was brought into advisory groups with patients and carers present. They sense-checked that. They said, does this make sense? Does this model make sense? And that model can deal with anything from sort of symptomatic relief, if you like, in a single disease state through to a potentially curative therapy. Very, very broad. We have undertaken various pieces of work to try to capture burden of illness. Again, starting with patients and families and what's important to them, working with clinicians to identify what things may change clinical practice or not, and then working with companies to understand, can you use this? Is this going to help achieve access? Is this going to help with your HEOR plans? And I'll stop there. I'll talk for the rest of the session.
That's excellent. Thanks so much, Josie. And what a success story, and an evidence point to the power of communities in driving positive change within HEOR in collaboration with experts and physicians. And that power is latent in so many different corners of the world, but health literacy is a fundamental foundation to mobilizing the power within those communities. So I just want to change direction a little bit for this question and come to Christina, and looking at health literacy in HEOR. Where do you think we are, and how well are we doing?
Thank you. I think it's really relevant because health literacy is the capacity of individuals and organizations, institutions, societies to make sure that people can find and understand and judge and use information to take decisions, to take informed decisions and share decisions, not least to protect their health and the health in communities. Health literacy is a newer concept, but it's an outcome of the formal and informal education that we all have. But we also know that health happens to us during lifetime. And as we heard today, whenever we come across a new disease, we have to learn something new and perhaps also de-learn some skills. And often it's under really harsh conditions where you also in an emotional distress. So therefore, it's important that we as a society really take responsibility to help and protect people and give them the right information at times when they need it. And we have seen from our research that unfortunately it's not happening everywhere. It's still something we need to improve. And it's also related to data that we have available. We see that for now, it's data is mostly generated as part of research projects and in a very isolated way. My hope is that in the future, health literacy will be a quality indicator for the work conducted by healthcare institutions, but also research institutions. Because when we know how people actually use information and adapt to empower themselves and their families and their communities, they can act in a more timely way. So it's always like a coin. You have on one hand the individual perspectives and the life world, like we heard from Danielle, how she experienced the whole new situation of a rare disease. And on the other side of the coin is how we as a system prepare ourselves and learn from the experience turned into data, and how we then adapt the data and analyze them to make predictions that can help others and also scale up efforts to support larger proportions of populations. So that's where we are at now. We are trying to move from a project-based research initiative on health literacy to really increase a systemic response to support people to be empowered.
Can I jump in here? Just saying something, Gavin? I think it's really interesting when we talk about health literacy as something that we need to adjust. The patients need to get the information so they understand it. But I also think it could be interesting if we talk about the doctors need to obtain patient literacy. They need to obtain the literacy to understand what the families are actively saying. Because we can always talk about how they should descale, how they talk. But how come we are not educating them on understanding what we are saying to them? Yeah, I just wanted to say that health literacy. Yeah.
A very valuable point, Danielle. And I think it's we have to realize that we spend so little time actually in touch with the healthcare system. It's 15 minutes here and there in a consultation.
Yeah.
And there is no way that our health professionals can fully, in that time, understand the emotions that follows with certain conditions and how to live with their certain disease. And that's where we need the partnerships and learn from patients. But that's something that should also be a priority in health education and education of health professionals. And luckily, we do see an increase in communication skills and cultural diversity and sensitivity towards different diseases. But definitely, we can make that bridge much stronger between patient experience and the expertise of the support that health professionals can give.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, Danielle, for asking some supplementary questions or making some comments there. And thank you, Christina. I'm back. I got that dreaded or something gone wrong snap emoji. So I'm delighted to be back. I think what we've heard to date is, the latent power of the community, the need for health literacy and improvements to unlock that power. I wanted to just come to Kelly now to talk about what regulators are doing and what are your...
I think Gavin is frozen.
I think we lost Gavin again.
Yeah, but we can talk amongst ourselves though. So Kelly?
Well, he got halfway through his question, which I think was to throw to me for some observations of what regulators are doing in their push towards more patient and community involvement. Yes. I'm happy to speak on that for a little bit, but my experience has been largely focused on development of PRO tools, so patient-reported outcome tools, questionnaires that are used to support clinical trial endpoints. And in the early development of these tools, we focus a lot on what questions we should be asking or which symptoms we should be measuring from the patient perspective in these questionnaires. And within that sort of niche area, I've seen substantial movement from regulators over the past couple decades to encourage, cajole, require more direct patient input in the construction and interpretation of trial endpoints. From the FDA, at least, which is where the bulk of my experience lies, the message is really twofold. First, in order for treatment to be deemed effective and to be evaluated for treatment efficacy, there really needs to be this notion that it improves the aspects of the condition that are important to patients. So, for example, if a drug moves a biomarker but really isn't able to demonstrate meaningful improvement in the way a patient feels or functions, it's less likely to get a favorable review from regulators. So I think that bar has been set fairly nicely. And the second aspect of this is really when determining how to measure the patient experience with treatment, select an endpoint specifically. There's now more requirements for there to be direct patient engagement in the selection and development of those measurement tools. And for my work, this aspect has really been the most exciting evolution. I started in the HEOR and kind of PRO space back in 2006, which was right around when the FDA's first patient-reported outcomes guidance was released in draft form. And it made some waves at the time by asserting that evidence of direct qualitative input from patients would be required for PRO tools that would support labeling claims. And since that declaration, the subsequent 15 years or so have seen continual advancements in how we engage patients in these processes. There's been improvement in methods and ultimately a proliferation of more active partnerships around what it is that we measure in clinical trials. We've seen increased use of qualitative research to incorporate the patient experience in ways more than just to develop patient-reported outcome tools. It's now much more common for sponsors to be including exit interviews as part of clinical trial design to provide some immediate feedback on the experience of participating in the study, in addition to just the treatment effects. We've seen other involvement of patients more directly, not just as research participants, but as advisors developing the content of those studies and developing, hand in hand with researchers, how the study design is created. As Josie described, there's been increasing sponsorship of PRO development activities by patient organizations directly. So these are not just sponsored by pharma or governmental entities. There are patient groups binding together and saying, there aren't good endpoints, there aren't good measures of the condition. That's hampering drug development because we can't have trials without measuring things. And they're just getting it done, right, as you've seen. And I think there's also been further evolution of the regulatory guidance. And from the FDA's perspective, at least, that's kind of most noticeable in their current patient-focused drug development guidance series, which is a 4-part effort to sort of update the PRO guidance from back in 2006 and really clarify the methods that we should apply, the approaches we should take when generating patient experience data. And I think, similar to what we saw in 2006, I'm quite encouraged by these developments within the regulatory space. In 2006, it sparked a lot of methods development and a lot of activity on how we can better engage patients. I think the PFDD guidance that is happening now will do exactly that for hopefully the next decade or two as we move forward with these sorts of efforts.
Great.
Can I ask a question again?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so I'm very new to this PRO method, as I am not much into that part of research. But what is the limitations? Like what can't PRO be used for? Where is the gaps in PRO?
Right. So patient-reported outcomes fall within a kind of broader set of outcome measurements, which we call clinical outcome assessments, right? So that includes both patient-reported outcomes as well as caregiver or clinician-reported outcomes. Can also include sort of functional tests, performance measures. But what we're really focused on is finding sort of the right fit for the concept of interest that we're looking at. In most cases, that is symptoms, but in some cases, it's functional decrements or other things, and the population that we're looking at. And there's been, an increase starting, with the 2006 guidance and even before that, increased need for there to be evidence of a match between the patient population and measuring the right concepts. So that's sort of the biggest piece. They can be applied in any areas as long as those boxes are checked, and we can provide evidence that, what we're measuring is important to patients. It can be measured reliably. effectively from a psychometric perspective, has appropriate measurement properties. So all of those things need to be in place. When those are in place, we can apply patient-reported outcome tools to really, any condition that might have a subjective patient experience component.
Thank you so much.
Can I come in on that, Gavin? Would that be okay?
Go for it.
That was all very true. It's also quite technical. So I'm thinking literacy for patients maybe not quite perfected when we start talking about these tools. And one of the key things that I think is important to say, given the audience we have on the line, is whilst these can measure things that are important to patients' families, they can't measure everything that is important to patients and families. And they will inevitably be looking at identifying those aspects of the lived experience of the condition that may be most likely to change in a trial, or maybe most likely to be measurable within a time span of a trial. And there are obviously other things that will be hugely important, Danielle, to you and your family, and to those on the webinar. And that's one of the gaps, I think, for me, is that there's a limit to the amount of nuance you can have. There's a limit to the amount of granularity and sort of comprehensiveness that you can have. Sorry, I hope you don't mind me adding that, Kelly.
No, absolutely.
And then a follow-up question. So if you have like this drug you want to develop and you want to add this pro concept, is it enough that one family says, well, it's important for us? Or will you have some saying, okay, we need to have 10 families saying this is important? Sorry if it's dumb questions, but I'm...
No, not at all. I think you're both raising very good points. And, to Josie's point, I think, that underscores getting the research right when we identify what concepts are most important, because we can't, in a given trial, we can't assess every single symptom that a patient with this condition might have. So we do need to be able to have good ways of prioritizing those. And I think we're getting better at leveraging and listening to patients to let them tell us what are the more important things to mention. What are the more important things to measure, not just, what's the low-hanging fruit that's easy to measure. Right, we need to get that right. So I think that's a big part of it. We can get into the technical aspects of sample size and kind of the number of people, but there is sort of also been an acknowledgement from regulators that we need to be flexible with that, especially in rare conditions where we may only have a handful of patients available that can tell us about their experience. In more common conditions, we will try to involve more, but that's been another sort of, I think, appropriate evolution of our methods in the last several years, is that there's sort of this recognition that, in some conditions we will need to get what we can and do as well as we can with the patients that are available, especially in rare conditions.
Yeah, no, really good points around the importance of co-creation there with the patient community to make sure that the measures are the right ones and the prioritized ones as well. Kelly, just to put you further on the spot, there's a question from Peggy in the audience. Thanks very much for your questions, Peggy. We'll start with the first one you had, which is what are the key patient outcomes to measure when talking about digital health tools, such as remote monitoring devices for diabetic patients?
So I think, those, in any case, we're really going to have to focus on developing an understanding of what is important to patients. So I don't know if I can necessarily give an answer without talking more about the process of how we would engage patients. There are guidance within, regulatory guidance around use of digital tools and how they need to be tested and how that sort of dovetails with the content of those sorts of tools. But in each of those cases, we would need to demonstrate evidence that, we're measuring the appropriate things from the patient perspective. We're measuring it in a way that patients can interact with those devices or those measurement tools and establish what needs to be assessed.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kelly. We'll move on to Beth, and just wanted to spend a few moments talking about patient involvement evolving within the publication of data and associated communications. What are you seeing?
So listening to everyone, I think something that underlines what everyone so far has talked about, whether it's from the Danielle and the patient's perspective, Josie and a rare disease perspective, Kelly and the PROs, or Christina and health literacy, is that we need to communicate what we are doing. And we need to identify who we are communicating with. I think there was a question of, doctors and patients discussing and what that communication needs to look like. Danielle, I believe you brought that out. We need to understand who our stakeholders are. If I take a step back, I mentioned I've been doing this for 20 years. And when I started, we talked about abstracts, posters, and manuscripts, and those were geared towards clinicians. They went to conferences, they went to medical journals, and that was all we saw. Occasionally, you may see something in a doctor's office, right, that may have mentioned a drug. We are now moving way beyond that. We still have abstracts, we still have posters, we still have manuscripts. We are now including patients to help us develop those manuscripts, particularly if they have helped, say, develop with Kelly a PRO tool. They may be of being an author. We are also including lay summaries with those manuscripts. So yes, while they still may be geared towards a physician or clinician audience, there's a section there that perhaps summarizes that study a bit more for patients or for the lay population to understand it. We are also presenting things visually. So instead of reading a 10-page clinical trial, you might be able to understand what that trial was visually. You can see how it was done, who was involved, and then what those results are. And this is all to reach broader audiences. Also, the one thing I am seeing more and more is not only including patients in, say, the publication development, but also sharing results with patients. So if you develop a survey and you bring in, or you give that survey, say, to a registry and patients participate, you need to make sure that you're communicating the results back to that population. So maybe you do a post on social media so they can see it. And no, you can't specifically, there are confidentiality issues, but you can get that out and say, listen, we developed this patient-reported outcome. These are the results, and this is what we found. And you can make sure that that goes out to multiple populations, multiple stakeholders, not just in, say, a journal that perhaps clinicians only have access to. So I think over the past 20 years, we are definitely seeing a huge growth to where we are focusing our communications. We are seeing our audiences broaden, going from just clinicians to including clinicians and regulators and also patients. And we are seeing the types of products that we are developing to share results change, going from manuscripts that are focused to clinicians to manuscripts that may include lay summaries and that really look at the audience that we are targeting.
Great. Thank you, Beth, for that response. So, we're hearing about the latent power of patient communities out there to support HEOR, the importance of co-creation, and the importance of dissemination and health literacy. I've got a question here, actually, Christina, that I'll come to you with, and then we've got another couple of topics, or indeed, if there are questions out there in the audience, please fire them over, and we'll try and answer them. But how HEOR health literate do you think different stakeholders are? This is Peggy's question around, it seems that decision makers are interested in the results, but not the assumptions made in the model. So they're looking at it from a very much a surface view. What's your observations of decision makers around health literacy, Christina?
I think you're spot on. I don't think we are there yet. And just the way you phrased the questions, how patients can support physicians on their research, I think we should turn it around and say, how can physicians, support patients to live their lives with whatever conditions they have? And I think that is a missing pillar in our research when we talk about measurements and qualitative research. I would love to see much more observational studies where our researchers actually go and follow in the footsteps of patients and see how they live their lives and where are the barriers, and observe the barriers in their homes and at work and so on. I think we're still working in some kind of artificial way when we ask our questionnaires and so on, and even through interviews. It just gives an extra dimension to our research and our outcomes and our ways to interpret it if we actually see the barriers. And I base it on my own experiences working with people living in children living in poor families. It was only actually when I was interviewing those children in their homes, I could see how much they actually suffer and how they could not be included in our normal routines in a welfare society. And also, last point I would like to make here is that many European countries are considering themselves as welfare societies with good healthcare systems, good educational systems, and still we see a high barrier in relation to health literacy. We take too much for granted or for given that people just understand health information in all ways and know how to navigate the complexity of systems. And that's where we can learn so much, both in terms of research and in practice. Thanks, Gavin.
Thank you, Christine. And no, some really important points there. And, as an industry, we'll often invite patient communities into our offices. But I think, as you described, the power really is for the industry to go to the patients and really understand what it's like living with a condition and how
we can learn from marketing. Any product, they would do that. And I think that's where we can learn from other industries.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I also, if I can add, I also think that's where the rare disease communities are so unique, because we are gathering in social media groups. We do not have a bunch or an army of doctors interesting to find cures for us because they do not have the funding. But we are experts in our everyday lives. And when we're sharing our narratives on the social media groups, we can start to identify the patterns. We can start to accelerate research, and we can start to invite the doctors into our research based on our observations. That's co-creation and patient-driven research. And I think that's the future, when we start to turn around the paradigm of research. Who is actually capable of asking the good question? I believe that's the patients and their caregivers.
Could I just come in to build on what Danielle said? And you're absolutely spot on. You put it far more eloquently than I was about to try to do. It's about recognizing, and we see this a lot in the rare disease space, but also elsewhere, all patient communities, if we can call them that, are different. What might work with one community may not work with others. I've heard a little bit quite recently, there's a few people talking about going into the home, observing patients or families living with a condition in the family. And I've spoken to people who think it's a great idea, talking patient advocates here, and others who reacted with horror at the thought of yet another burden. And I don't think we've talked at all about the burden that is placed on patients, on families participating in this research. And so by doing as Danielle says, let's put patients in and families in the driving seat. They know the condition, they know what's possible, and they also know where they're at right now in terms of their understanding of the systems, of the processes they're trying to navigate, and of what might be acceptable to the people that they're working with. And it is a huge burden. And I know as researchers, we want to know everything. We want to ask every question and know everything. But a lot of that is not necessarily our business. It's not necessarily essential to doing the drug development, asking hurdles or HEOR reimbursement. So I think we need to be able to balance a little better what we're asking from patients and families with what we're going to do with what we learn from them.
Absolutely. Excellent points around really understanding the capacity to support and recognizing that within the design of any research. I think that's just such a critical point. And I just wanted to sort of build on that, Josie, and come straight back to you in terms of better engagement with patient community so they trust our intentions. I think, talking about capacity, having one point of contact with patient communities just seems to make a whole lot of sense rather than multiple people from different parts of the business. contact in the one individual representing the patient organization. But I just wondered, in your work, what other ways are you seeing in terms of building trust and ensuring that we support patient communities and ensure that we maintain their independence whilst doing it?
So I'm actually not always a fan of having a single person in a company being the gatekeeper, if you like, to that company. If I think of Project Hercules, that has only been successful by the patient community engaging very much directly with commercial and market access and other parts of commercial organizations, not filtered through a primary contact, always in patient advocacy departments, patient engagement departments. So I think there's a role, but it's not always important to sort of, it can be a barrier. It can be a barrier to having the respectful co-creation conversations that I think most of us on this call would like to see happening, because they're not being heard directly by the people who are commissioning the work. But more importantly than that, I think it's a mindset to move from doing to the community to doing with the community, or even doing for the community, and patient organizations very much in the driving seat and leading the way there.
Or even by the community.
Exactly, yeah, just giving them the money and let them get on with it. So there's definitely different sort of versions. Different patient organizations will be at different places of readiness to do that. They will have priorities, but they'll have limited resources, they'll have all sorts of needs and expectations. And I think that's where it comes back to ensuring that there is a kind of shared understanding of what is needed at different stages. And for me, ultimately, that means designing and working together with a patient access perspective. So not even just an HTA barrier or approval, but actually what will we need to have? What will the ecosystem need to look like? What evidence, information will we need to have in place in order to ensure that if this work is successful, patients will actually receive treatment. Diagnostic pathways will be sorted out. There'll be referrals, there'll be prescriptions, there'll be reimbursement. And I think sometimes we get very siloed, and then it's very hard, I think, for patients to develop that trust, patient advocates to develop that trust with companies, because they're talking to someone who's not looking further ahead or not able to take that broader view of what challenges are being faced. Right? I'm sure Danielle will have other views that be really interested in whether that resonates with you or you've had a different.
Well, I have a dream that some pharma company will come and ask me a bunch of questions to find a cure for my kids. That's just not the reality of our rare disease. We are trying to build a boat while not drowning, because we are currently out of any wood or nails. We do not have anything. We only have the ability to swim ourselves. So I really, really believe that we need to call up, and this is maybe a different direction, but we need to have a responsible framework within the European Commission to support these rare disease organizations to start to generate their own data. Because we might have a handful of rare diseases working with regulators and pharma companies, but there is so many trying to just not drown and try to accelerate research with zero funding, with zero experts, simply based on the narratives of the families trying to do something. But it's very, very difficult to raise funds when you are only 100 families in the world, or trying to accelerate the interest from the industry when all you have is a Facebook group and a bunch of stories. We need patient registries, and we need the industry to be interested, but they are not interested if we do not have proper data. Yeah. So if any industry people out there want to ask me questions to find a cure for our disease, I am all for it. So please contact me then.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Danielle and Josie. I want to come to Christina and Beth with a question around how, I think during the pandemic, we we really got to understand the reality of sharing accurate information as soon as possible, and how things could get misconstrued very easily. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on how we accurately communicate data, results, and analysis whilst using understandable language for the stakeholder we're trying to educate. Should we start with Christine at first and then come to Beth?
Yeah, thank you. I was considering how we can improve communication, because sometimes reading scientific papers, it's like reading an instruction manual to your television or something. It's really dry. It's a lot of numbers, a lot of letters, and you actually wouldn't know if that's about people. I do think we need to add the human factor and the human perspectives of what kind of consequences diseases have on people's lives, as much as on the physical, consequences and what is happening at biochemistry level or whatever. And I think we all have an obligation in our research communication to take on that human perspective, not only as a lay perspective to make it understandable, but also from a human perspective, make it understandable, because a lot of this research is also used for ethical choices or for shared and informed decision making, and what might look good on paper may not be the best solution for a person to take a choice. So we have to be much more comprehensive or holistic, to make it the use of that word, in our communication. And yes, you're right, there is so much mis and disinformation out there, and people with rare diseases or any disease is in a very vulnerable position, and there are many stakeholders who want to take advantage of that vulnerable position. So that's why health literacy is also important to prevent any further harm to take place. I'm happy. I look to hear from you, Beth. What's your thoughts?
Danielle,
Yeah.
did you want to say something first?
Sorry, I just wanted to add that I also find it very, very confusing as a human being that these doctors are publishing medical literature to help the patients, but it's like writing the Bible in Latin. There was a time where it was only people who were able to understand Latin who understood the Bible. That's how I view PubMed and other scientific databases. Like, why are we not translating it so all of this amazing work can get out to those who they are actually trying to help? What is that? That's a huge, weird gap. I don't understand it. And I think we could do so much better. And I also think that if we suddenly have the lay abstracts, then other doctors would also be able to understand what their colleague just published. That would be neat. Sorry, that was a...
Maybe it's not the same paper, and maybe it's not the same article. Then we might still need that communication, the medical communication from an expert to an expert. But it's different when you have another audience. But I'm sure Beth also have some perspectives on this.
So I think both of you highlighted, we need to understand the audience that we are writing for. And that may at times be broad and include clinicians and patients. And other times, maybe we focus on a patient audience. And if that's the case, how we can make sure our information, always we want to present accurate information, but before that's published, let's bring in some patients and have them pre-read the article. If we're writing something for a patient audience and we haven't received feedback from patients before going to publication, we're probably missing an important step. Now, the other thing that, Gavin, you did ask from the start, how do we ensure that information is accurate? Mentioned yesterday during the pandemic, I do think one of the things we do need to share as we're publishing our research and results from our research is that research by nature, results are always changing, right? What we know today is not going to be the same as what we know tomorrow. So when working with my writers, oftentimes people will go, a recent article published. Well, if someone is reading that article 20 years from now, it's not recent anymore, and our recommendations may not be the same. So I think whether you're a clinician, whether you're a patient, you need to understand that what we know today is not going to be the same as what we know tomorrow. And I think in the pandemic, we can look at masking. It went from no masks to masks. We look in oncology and, you may be getting one treatment and results come out and show something is better. So we need to make sure everyone is aware that science is ever changing, and it's not that information that we gave is inaccurate. It's just that we continue to learn. And we need to share those new results.
Great, excellent. Thank you very much. Thanks to David for his comments, and Catherine, there's a link there for you, Danielle, to and maybe connect with Catherine on the question of patient-led registries. Another question here from Peggy, which is a really interesting final point I'd like to just throw out to anyone who wants to contribute, and that is, how do we ensure inclusivity and diversity within our HEOR research processes, particularly, socioeconomic background, health literacy, literacy in general, race. What can we do to ensure that we have a diverse and accurate perspective with our research?
Part of it, I think, is to have a really good dialogue with the people that it's about, or that have the lived experiences. And I know some of the pharmaceutical companies that I've been working with to discuss health literacy, they have been really aware now that they did not actually always include people with diverse backgrounds in their medical trials, for example, and they're trying to make up for it now by putting much more in awareness to health literacy and cultural aspects and different ages or whatever. So for many companies, they actually now try to include it, but of course it takes time before we incorporate diversity as an asset in all these processes. And Beth made me think of one point, and also Danielle. I think really the medical jargon is like a language, and sometimes we also have to make sure that we use the medical language to make it accurate. Back to your question, that's why they write in this specific way, to make their communication so accurate as possible about a certain medical topic. And sometimes it's on us to learn that language, because then we get the deepest insights. But if we want to read really wide, we have to make it less complex, and that's where the lay summaries come into the game. So I guess it's a give and take game here we play in terms of different languages.
I'm not sure it's always less complex, but it is perhaps more sort of plain language, or I would say plain English. I recall when I started working at NICE, I had to take colleague with me at every meeting because they used the English language in ways I had never heard it used before. I really didn't have a clue what people were talking about. Not because I wasn't able to understand the concept, but because they were using words that we would commonly use in very different ways, in very specific ways. And I needed at first to sort of have something, what they mean when they use this word is actually something completely different. And once you grasp that, that's great. But I don't think the onus should be on the patient groups or the stakeholders to understand that. It should be on people to be able to explain what they're doing in the language that a high school graduate ought to be able to understand.
Very quickly, Danielle. We're running very rapidly out of time, but very quickly.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I often, in the beginning, when I didn't speak doctor, I didn't understand what I didn't understand. So I had to ask the doctor if I could tape the conversation so I could analyze what I didn't understand and start to Google it afterwards, because I wasn't able to tell him what I didn't understand. It was just rubbish for me, everything he said. So, yeah.
Thank you, Danielle. And thank you so much to the panel for really some great insightful comments. Thanks to the audience for listening in and your questions and your comments. Stay tuned for the white paper, and we'll get that across to anyone that has registered for the panel discussion. If you want to connect with any of the panelists, I'm sure they'd be very open to that. So thanks again to everyone, and really appreciate you tuning in. Thanks a lot.
Big thanks again to the panelists and also to the audience here for participating. In closing, we hope you enjoyed this webinar, and we'll see you again next time.